So I'm just going to do a very brief introduction. I realized when I was thinking about what to say, it's really hard to summarize the career of Bill Fletcher, just because he's done such a wide range of things. You know, when you have someone who has a degree from Harvard and has worked as a welder in a shipbuilding company and has been an organizer and a co-founder of the Black Radical Congress, it's just an incredibly inspiring resume, and Bill has done so many things. Some of you know him from early in his career. He worked in Massachusetts with District 65, now the UAW, and he went on to work with Service Employees International Union, SEIU, in a number of different roles. Bill worked at the AFL-CIO, the Central Labor Federation in Washington, D.C. for a while as Director of Education, and as a special assistant to John Sweeney when he became president of AFL-CIO. And Bill has done all kinds of other things, like he was president of the Trans-Africa Forum for a couple of years, where he worked on foreign policy, and he's remained very engaged around education and issues of U.S. foreign policy. So we're really pleased to have him here. I also need to say he's written these 2 books in the past few years in the middle of everything else he's been doing. And he'll talk about them a little bit, and they'll be for sale at the end of the talk. As the Labor Center, we're thrilled to host Bill because he's really kind of the model of a scholar who does intellectual work and is critically engaged with questions around politics and the labor movement. And he's also an activist and someone who takes what he thinks and what he talks about and works with other people to figure out how to really change the world and address some of the problems that we're facing. So it's my honor to introduce Bill Fletcher.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's really good to be here, and it's especially good to see old friends and to embrace them. When I saw Ferd, I'm thinking about District 65, and which was then an autonomous part of the United Auto Workers that collapsed in the early 90s and was completely absorbed by the United Auto Workers, and it was a sad ending to a very proud union. But it's good to see folks, and I'm very honored that everyone's here. And what I want to do is, I'm actually anxious to get to the Q&A and the discussion, but I want to outline some thoughts. And then the critical point of today is for you guys to buy these books. It really is. Let's be real. So I actually want to start by talking some about what happened with the writing of the second book, and then I want to do some contextual stuff. This book, They're Bankrupting Us, and 20 Other Myths About Unions, was commissioned by Beacon Press. They asked me to write it. They called me and they asked me to write it, and I said I would. I looked at my schedule and I said, even though there was a very quick turnaround, I could do it. They asked me in March, they needed a first draft November 1st. And I said, okay, the schedule looks pretty open. And that was my first mistake. Because what then happened was just a series of disasters. The death of Manny Marable, the death of my father, a hurricane that flooded the basement. Thereby we lost documents, in some cases that went back to the 1970s, which I was hoping to archive at some point. But we got this in time. But part of what I did in writing the book, it was based in, as it says in the beginning, on a discussion I had on a plane going from San Jose to San Diego. And I was sitting next to this woman, this young woman in her 30s, young for me, I'm 58, but who was very nice, very friendly, and was looking at me reading this book on global labor solidarity. So she said, "What are you reading?" I explained. She said, "I always like to know what people are reading." So I explained what I was reading, and she said, "What is a labor union?" And at first I thought she was BSing me. I really did. And I realized quickly that she wasn't. She was very serious. She did not have any idea what a union was. So I began to explain to her what a union was. And she nodded her head in the way that someone nods their head when they have no idea what you're talking about. And this book is for her. I don't remember her name, but in writing the book, every chapter was a dialogue with her. We were sitting around having coffee, and I was responding to the kinds of questions that I knew that she would be asking. And I'm hoping that this book is of use, particularly to organizers. It's not the kind of book that's going to win Bill O'Reilly over. There is no book that will win. Not even the Holy One. You know, he is what he is. But there's a lot of people out there that are really good folks that have no idea what a union is, or barely an idea. And this book is aimed at trying to address myths and broad brush criticisms that exist about unions, and address it in a way that is not Pollyannish. The book doesn't pull punches. There's a chapter, for example, on corruption and the mob. There's some people that say, well, we in the union movement shouldn't talk about that. We shouldn't talk about the fact that the mafia has penetrated certain unions at times. We should just ignore that because it's all part of management's attempt to destroy us. But the reality is that there's truth there. I mean, there are unions that have been penetrated. And I felt that if you don't tell the truth, your credibility is gone. And not telling the truth includes not saying certain things. So I hope that you find the book of use. You know, there's a story that I like to tell about this man who jumped off the Empire State Building. And as he was falling past the 60th floor, he was overheard saying, "So far, so good." And I think about that every time I think about the union movement. Because we have been in a steady decline as a movement. I would argue, not simply on numbers, but I would argue since the Cold War purges of the 40s, the movement has been in decline. But the problem is that because it hasn't hit rock bottom, at each floor as we drop, the leaders can say, "So far, so good." After each battle that we lose, they can say, "Well, but we still have our headquarters in Washington," right? Or we still have X members, or maybe we'll merge with someone we should never merge with, but we'll merge with them anyway so that our numbers go up so that some of us will have a pension when the lights go out, right? And as I'm going to talk about tonight, we're facing a war of annihilation at this moment. This is the final offensive by the right wing against us. We're not even in a period that's analogous to what happened with Reagan, when Reagan took over and moved against PATCO, which is a complicated story, where there was an attempt to weaken unions. They're not seeking to weaken unions. We should be clear about that. They're seeking to annihilate unions. And if you listen to any of the discussions that were taking place in the Republican convention, or you look at these different groups that have emerged over the last number of months in Citizens United, it's clear that their objective is to get rid of unions, period. And the challenge then for unions is whether or not we can conduct successfully a reformation, as my friend Jerry Tucker used to say, or a transformation in sufficient time to beat this back? Or are we going to find ourselves in a situation where we're literally picking up, trying to rise like a phoenix bird? The context in which this is operating is very important. I was thinking, I was watching much of the debate last night, and I thought that Obama did very, very well. He certainly did better than in the first debate, and he was back sort of the way that he has been, and that many of us have associated him. He was full of energy, had good answers, slapped Romney a few times, which I just enjoyed. But what was interesting in listening to the debate was what was not said. So for example, when they had that very bizarre altercation around China, what's interesting, what that reminded me of, and you have to forgive me because my mind thinks in military metaphors and film metaphors. There was a film called The Formula in the late 1970s that had, I think, Max von Sydow, and I think it had Marlon Brando. And Marlon Brando played the role of a head of a major oil company. And there's a certain discussion that's going on in the offices of Brando, and someone is talking about the Arabs, talking about who controls the oil. And this was at the time of these oil shortages. And at a certain point, Brando says, "We are the Arabs." And he didn't dwell on it, but it was a very interesting point because what he was talking about was actually who controlled the oil, right? That it wasn't the Arabs controlling the oil, with these multinational corporations that control the oil. So when last night when they're talking about China, it's like, we are the Chinese. I don't mean anyone in this room, but I mean US capital, right? That when you're looking at multinational capital, when they're talking about this alleged threat from China, what they're not talking about is the reorganization of global capitalism and what that means in terms of where companies are and who actually owns them. And so we end up getting into this play to xenophobia, when what has to happen, and this is really the job the union movement should be taking up, is explaining who really owns what, and how does power actually exist on a world scale. And that was one thing that was missing. Another thing that was missing was, I was thinking when this gentleman stood up and talked about how he had voted for Obama in 2008 and that things hadn't been going so well in the last 4 years. And what Obama didn't say was that we exist in the context of a global crisis of capitalism. This is not simply a crisis in the United States. It's not simply a crisis, by the way, brought on by George Bush. That it's a crisis, and Obama wasn't going to say this, right? But let's just pretend that I'm channeling, right? So maybe what he could have said is something like this: that in capitalism, you have these cycles, and that these cycles are built into capitalism the way that earthquakes are fundamental in California. That if you're going to live in California, you have to be prepared to deal with earthquakes. If you don't like earthquakes, don't move to California. If you don't accept that there are going to be recessions and depressions, then you can't exist within capitalism, because that is fundamental to the way that capitalism operates. So one of the things that I would have loved to have seen Obama say is, knock, knock, we're in capitalism. Right? And that part of what happens in capitalism is that there are these crises. And these crises are brought about, in general, by overaccumulation and overproduction. There's overproduction of goods, overaccumulation of capital, and there's overaccumulation of capital not because people don't need money and things, but that the people that have it can't find places to invest in and get the profits that they want. But the other thing I would have wanted Obama to talk about, which some people have, is that what happened in 2007 was a combination of a cyclical crisis catalyzed by a fiscal crisis. And that's where the policies, not just of George Bush, but of Bill Clinton and others, played such a very important role in terms of opening up the floodgates to all sorts of speculation. The combination of these two crises brought about on a global scale what people are calling the Great Recession, or what some people are calling the milder depression. But in either case, the economic crisis that we're operating within. This problem didn't start, however, in 2007. And I don't mean the problem of capitalism, but this particular economic crisis. The problem of capitalism is a longer lecture, which you can talk to me about later. But it has been something that has been growing with the reorganization of capitalism since the 1970s, with what has come to be known as neoliberalism. and a different form of accumulation. Now, I want to go back to the debate, because part of what's happening out there, which is not being spoken to on the scale that needs to be spoken to by labor, is that, I don't think that's a commentary, is that there are huge sections of the population that expected that their living standard would continue to increase. And since the 1970s, it's been declining. Now, this is something that the AFL-CIO was trying to address in the 1990s in this project called Common Sense Economics, which some folks here at UMass played a major role in with the Center for Popular Economics. The AFL-CIO became interested in talking, believe it or not, in having a discussion with workers about capitalism. They didn't quite call it that. That's what I called it. That's what a lot of other people called it. And that's what it was. It was a discussion about capitalism and about what was happening. And in the 1990s, part of what was important to raise in people's consciousness was that there was this declining living standard. And that with this declining living standard, that what was happening is that people were responding as individuals rather than responding collectively. And as a result, debt was increasing. And I think in the 90s, personal debt was something like $5,000 a month or something like it. It's just something, and that wasn't talking about housing and cars. It was that people were accumulating massive amounts of debt on their credit cards in order to sustain a living standard that they believed that they were entitled to. In the absence of a labor movement that was practicing and preaching collective struggle, individuals interpreted what was happening to them as an individual phenomenon. That was the first response. It was sort of, I'm not balancing my checkbook. I'm not working hard enough. Not enough members of my family are working and contributing. That was sort of the first response. And as a result, let's go into debt, let's use the credit card. But then a second response started to emerge. And we started to see it in the Midwest, in the 1980s actually. Not in the 1990s, it was in the 1980s. And it started in the Midwest, in rural areas, where a lot of farmers were facing foreclosures. Their lives were falling apart. And they started trying to figure out what exactly was happening to them. And in the midst of this, there was profound organizing that took place, but it wasn't our side that was doing the organizing. It was groups more like Posse Comitatus or the Aryan Nation. There were these right-wing populists, and some were outright fascist organizations that were actively organizing in the Midwest, and they were saying to people, it's not your problem. You are not to blame. Well, they were right about that. But who was to blame? Well, for that segment of the right wing, it was largely Jews. And the Jewish bankers, the Zionist occupation government was what they often described it as, was really at base. That was the force. And they started doing this organizing around this. And many of us on the left did not pay attention to this. Sort of laughed it off, sort of treated it as a sort of aberration. But as the 1980s went into the 1990s, and as people's living standard continued to decline when you factor in inflation, right-wing populism started to become a much more ever-present reality, particularly in white communities. That different elements started to pick up. This and the combination of the introduction of Fox News, or the Fox so-called news, you had this active right-wing propaganda that was spouting out these populist messages. And it was very, very dangerous, because what right-wing populism does is that it takes elements of what we on the left side of the aisle are saying. It takes them out of context, but it gives people a different target. So, for example, if you listen to someone like Pat Buchanan, you can, under certain circumstances, think that he's left-wing. And some people have even gone further and suggested that Pat Buchanan's right-wing populism, that it can somehow be dissected, that somehow we can win him over to being more of a pure populist as opposed to right-winger, not understanding that right-wing populism is an integral organism. It's not something that can be separated out. The right-wing populists have been appealing to much of the base of the labor movement. And their arguments are very, very persuasive because, you see, they have a narrative, and their narrative is to a great extent linked to the myth of the American myth. Their narrative is pretty simple, and I was thinking about this when I thought about common sense economics. It basically was, once upon a time, if you worked hard, you did well. And the lives of your children could be better than yours. That's the basic US myth. But then the right-wing populists say, but at a certain point we were betrayed. And it's at that juncture that they start talking about who it was is we and who did the betraying. Now, in the face of this, organized labor, and I'm going to focus on that, has basically done very little. Common sense economics was an interesting experiment that did not last. When it really came down to it, when the rubber should have been hitting the road, the National AFL-CIO did not put the funding in to really fully operationalize it, and the affiliates didn't take it and run with it. Why? Because they fundamentally don't believe in education. They'll talk about education, they'll talk about the need for education, but at the end of the day, they don't really believe in it. It is something that is expendable. When education is mentioned, maybe what they're talking about is PowerPoint. Let us do a PowerPoint presentation. Let us do something. Let us give a speech. And we'll have great speeches. Richard Trumka gives fantastic speeches, right? But that's not education. Those are speeches. What was needed and what continues to be needed is real grassroots worker education, talking with our members about precisely what is going on and what needs to be done in response. But there's other reasons that organized labor has been had great difficulty confronting this. And to a great extent, that's what we try to write about in Solidarity Divided. That the conception of trade unionism that dominates most of organized labor really is framed within what Samuel Gompers articulated at the end of the 19th century. It really is, and Lara and Joe and I were talking some about this on the way up here. There really is this idea that the union's job is to look out for the members in the workplace. It's look out for their benefits, their wages, and their working conditions, and that's it. That it's not to have an independent political view, practice, or organization. That it's not to challenge US foreign policy. It is basically to do what it can to improve the lives of people that happen to be in unions. Well, what happens when 88% of the workforce isn't in unions? What happens? What do we say to that 88%? What do we say to people who are suffering every day from economic injustice? Join a union? I mean, that's in fact what some labor leaders, union leaders have said. They're not labor leaders. The union leaders have said, join a union. But they have suggested that the union is not the vehicle for leading the struggle for economic justice, but it's essentially becomes a lobbying organization. So the basic conception of the union runs into the problem of how do we confront this neoliberal capitalism when we have 12% and declining share of the workforce. The other part of this is that the union movement at this point really is missing a narrative. The right wing has a narrative. We have facts, right? And let me just be very clear about this. Economic Policy Institute, which I love, produces on a regular basis incredible facts about what's happening to the working class. Very, very useful for any presentations, any educational effort you're doing. but it's insufficient. The facts never speak for themselves. People speak. People interpret facts. Those facts have to be turned into a narrative. A narrative is a story. The story needs to explain to workers why they're getting their asses kicked. It's not enough to tell people that they're getting their asses kicked. It's not enough to tell someone that that there's an upper 1%, because as we're hearing now, some people are saying, that's fine, I want to be in that 1%. What's wrong with being rich? You see, just throwing out the facts are not enough. We have to have a story. We have to have a story, and see, this is where it becomes complicated. Because see, for the right, as we saw last night, and in the last debate with Romney, they're not constrained by the facts. They don't have to tell the truth. I mean, they usually don't get called out. We on the left side of the aisle have to be very careful about what we say. And we actually do. There's a moral reason and there's a practical reason that we have to tell the truth. Right? So we have to tell a truth. We have to tell a story that is not as easy as what the right-wing populists would articulate. It's a story about a very complicated history of this country that's not about people came over here and the land was vacant and some people really worked hard and they did extremely well, and you know how the story goes and you know how the story ends. That's not the story that we have to tell. We do have to tell a story about land being robbed. We do have to tell a story about the immigrant women that worked in textile mills, dying in fires and dying of dust that they breathed in every day. We do have to tell the story about Mexican and Chicano mine workers and the conditions that they were working, or the Chinese workers building the railroads through the Rockies who were viewed as expendable. We do have to tell the story of slavery and be very straight about it, that it wasn't an accident, that this country was built on slavery. We do have to tell that story. We do have to tell a story about classes and class struggle. It's not a myth, it's not some sort of romance, it's not some sort of fantasy that we have the luxury of telling. We have to tell a very, very interesting and compelling story about how this country was constructed and why so many workers right now are in great agony, why they are screaming out, why they're looking for answers. That's the story that we actually have to tell. And that is what the union movement should be doing. Unfortunately, it isn't sufficiently. However, there are some interesting examples, and I want to move towards wrapping this up because I want to have some discussion. There are interesting examples of a different path. What Gapasine and I talked about in our book was the need to reconstruct trade unionism in what we call social justice unionism, where the objectives of unions and unionism is not simply wages, hours, and working conditions for those lucky enough, but really engaging in a fight for social and economic justice, and also redefining the labor movement as beyond people that happen to be in unions. The Chicago teachers' strike struck me as one of the most recent and interesting examples of a different form of trade unionism. And it reminded me in some ways of something that happened in '97 with the Teamsters strike against UPS, which I'll get to in a second. But what was interesting about the Chicago teachers strike is, as battered as teachers have been from one end of this country to the other, demonized forever by, whether it's so-called liberals like Bill Gates or reactionaries like the Koch brothers, attacks on teachers and teachers unions, on and on and on. In the lead up to the strike, there was mainstream anticipation that the strikers would lose if they even went on strike, that they would be defeated, that they would be isolated. Didn't quite work out that way. And what's interesting was that the reform leadership of that union, in preparing for the strike, had a very, very different vision, both in terms of how it explained issues to the members, but also how it explained issues to the public, so that the Chicago teachers strike became a strike for the kids. It became a strike for the parents. And regardless of how much the mainstream media attempted again and again to recast it, they weren't able to succeed. See, that points to a different approach to unionism. It really is an idea not simply of a tactical alliance with community groups, but really seeing the union as an expression of the fight for economic and social justice that transcends bargaining unit lines. I think that that was a brilliant example. When I was mentioning the Teamsters, in '97, under the reform leadership of Ron Kerry, the UPS anticipated a strike. And UPS knew that they were going to win the strike because they were going to cast the Teamsters as bloated and corrupt. The Teamsters, in preparing for the strike, did a massive internal education drive. But they also articulated externally some key messages. And one of the things is that they made the strike about full-time work. Because UPS wanted to create more part-time jobs, the Teamsters made the fight about full-time work. And when the strike happened, the public supported the Teamsters. And in poll after poll, the pollsters were trying to figure out, why are these people supporting the Teamsters? Because the public saw the Teamsters as fighting for them, as fighting for full-time work. And more members of the working class have to work part-time jobs, and people know you can't live that way. So there is the possibility that we can articulate a different kind of trade unionism. But it's not one, there's no silver bullet here. There's going to be various kinds of experiments. But here's where I want to wrap it up. I want to wrap it up with two points. One is this, that none of this will work without a transformation internal to the unions themselves that really begins with significant education. That is, discussions with the members, about what they feel. It's not, just the union newspaper or the union blog that has a picture of the president of the union playing football, but it's about real discussions. And it's not even just the speeches. Again, we have some good orators in the labor movement. Not enough, actually, but we have some good orators. But that's not enough, because a lot of our members feel that they're not listened to. They feel that they're ignored or that they're simply being talked at. We've got to reverse that. But the other thing that we have to do, which may sound very odd coming from me, is that we've got to do some focus on the white worker. Now, I know that may sound very strange, because if you read any of the stuff that I write, I'm always talking about the centrality of people of color, how black workers have been ignored, and blah, 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 and all that. And that's true, and I'm not repudiating any of that. But what I am saying is that if we're going to defeat right-wing populism, we've got to win over white workers, pure and simple. And that white workers right now are one of the angriest sectors of the population. Because, see, black folks have known, because we have a good historical basis to know this, that we're treated very badly in this society, right? Latinos, many Latinos, most Latinos, unless they're Cubans. No, nothing against Cubans, but let's just be real. No, this land was grabbed, and if they were in Puerto Rico, they were grabbed. Asians, a lot of Asians, didn't get treated very well here. White workers, see, this wasn't supposed to happen to white folks. What they've been going through since the mid-1970s simply wasn't supposed to happen to them. And we have to, on the left side of the aisle, we have to talk with people about that. Because the other side is right-wing populists, these Christian fundamentalists, right-wing Zionists, others are talking to that segment of the population. And they're saying that they have more in common with people like George Romney than they do with that black or that Latino or that Asian or that Mexican, whatever, that's working right next to them. This question of the white worker remains central if we're going to transform and we're going to succeed in beating back right-wing populism. I think that there's this tendency that we've been seeing, which is so ironic for any historian, to sort of write off white workers, to sort of assume that white workers can't be won to progressive, if not radical causes. That it's sort of, well, let's just hope that the number of minorities increases, so shit, we won't have to deal with this white worker much. But it doesn't work that way for a whole set of reasons, not the least of which, ask people in South Africa, right? You can have a majority. So our movement needs to figure out this question of the white worker. And it's got to have discussions, it's got to have organizers, etc., that are in white communities, are meeting with and talking with white workers, because we have to be the ones that are countering this right-wing populist ideological influence. I think that people see it all the time, and it's not necessarily going to be just one set of ideas. We're going to find people that have very partial ideas. It's got to be our job as a different kind of union movement to respond to that. So with that, I'm just going to wrap up, and let's open it up and have some discussion.